In the first part of this two-part series on understanding leftist hysteria, I described the social identity of the left, why the left won't denounce Antifa, why many who are willing to go out with boots on the ground in anger, yet seemingly cannot describe the onus of their ire.
Hey! Did you know 43% of all cigarettes contain male semen and or babies? You're smoking babies.
Is that true?
Apparently.
Oh. Well, where'd you hear that?
I saw it one time when I was listening at the internet.
How group identity takes precedence over individual identity in instances of face threat, and how anonymity, such as is utilized by the black-clad black bloc, exacerbates the antisocial toxic disinhibition effects of de-individuation. Now that we understand the psychology behind much of the social identity expressed by the protesting and rioting left, we need to delve into the very concept of moral panics, given the ongoing moral panic we see occurring every single week, if not every single day. I mean, I cannot say the riot in Berkeley as I could in February, for instance, as there have been so many riots in Berkeley at this point. The phrase could refer to any one of them. This constant outrage and anger and desperation in the seeking out and burning of the witch of the Nazi, whether it be Nazi Orthodox Jew Ben Shapiro, or the rampaging in reaction to the Jason Stockley verdict, regardless of your own opinion on it, the left is embroiled in an ongoing campaign of reactionary chaos against a perceived evil. The villainous folk devil that is the right, just hiding beneath the surface of our placid American society. The Nazi next door. And that is what constitutes a moral panic. What is a moral panic? It's most simply defined as arousing interest and concern with a certain public issue. While typically this is blamed in part on the media, moral panics are far older than media alone. Moral panics are far older than our perception of modern media, and information travels through our own social networks. That has something to do with Facebook, by the way. Our social networks are communication and across friends and relatives in the form of rumors, the same way that it travels through communities through the distribution of newspapers or television. There is a difference actually here in that consistently we find, according to the agenda-setting function of the media, that's McCombs and Shaw 1972, that the media merely affects what topic we think about, not how we feel about those topics. No, word of mouth and shared social networks are far more likely to affect our perceptions, how we feel about an issue. See Christakis and Fowler 2009. As we have discovered, the social identity of the left, as do all social identities, includes an aspect of group affinity. We share things with those who are similar to us. We like them. They are part of our in-group. We talk to our friends, and in the case of a moral-based group such as the left, as we learned in the last video, we certainly don't talk to that evil out-group that we hate so much. This results in an echo chamber of ideas, and revolves around the left-leaning mainstream media, which does in fact still set the agenda to this day. There's been some debate about that, but go ahead, turn on CNN, MSNBC, turn on Fox, and you will find them sharing many of the same narratives, if not the exact same narrative. This is the value of alternative media. We don't get the memos. So, what are the ideas that are circulating in this social network of like-minded in-group people? Well, that Russia hacked the election, for example, that Trump is both an evil mastermind and an utterly incompetent fool, and most recently that this country is full of Nazis and card-carrying KKK grand wizards, and that Trump is their leader, and they need be physically removed. Nah, commies, we have the TM trademark on physical removal. Anyway, so we've got this group, a very morally based group, prone to all of the other issues and associated concepts involved with their social identity that come with that morally based social identity. And now we introduce a myopic focus on a moral issue, that this country is full of Nazis goose-stepping down your street right now, and you can't escape this topic because it is on every single channel, every website, and all of your friends and people that you trust are abuzz, spitting the word fascist from their mouths like a poison. And that, friendos, That is what creates a moral panic. So let's describe moral panics. Cohen 1973, that really is the book on moral panics, describes several aspects that categorize the issues upon which a moral panic is based. First, the issue must be new, but also having lay dormant for a while and allowed to fester in the minds of the people. The issue of Trump is obvious here. He's a relatively new threat, but as time goes on, the fear of him has, in fact, festered. It has become a pustulant wound in the left. Second, the issue must also be old and involve what is publicly perceived as a known evil. Well, who's the greatest monster of all time? Who do we learn in our history books is the true great devil? Is it Stalin? No. Was it Mao Zedong? No. Was it Pol Pot? No, it's Hitler. The physical manifestation of all things evil because, well, he sure couldn't compete on the kill count of Mao or Stalin. His focused propaganda against the Jews, and to a lesser extent the Roma and the Poles, though weirdly nobody cares how many fucking Poles he killed because they were considered just as non-white and lower because he fucking wanted their land. Yes, because his propaganda focused on racial issues and anti-Semitism. Therefore, Hitler is the worst, greatest evil that has ever existed. To say nothing of the fact that he was a socialist, and I'm tired of explaining that Hitler was a socialist. Nazism is a form of collectivism, get the fuck over it. Anyway, third, the issue is transparent, that these jackbooted fascists are everywhere, if you have just a keen enough eye to be able to spot them. And four, at the same time, the issue is simultaneously opaque, in that it is complicated and it is best left to thought leaders and media figures to explain this to us, such as retards like Don Lemon and Joy Reid do every fucking day. And thank you very much, Hillary, for explicating exactly how much you believe this in your horribly backwards comprehension of what 1984 was meant to convey. Moral panics usually occur as a reaction to an event. For an example, the murder of Jamie Bulger, a 2-year-old boy at the hands of 2 10-year-olds who tortured the poor child, sparked national outrage in the UK against video nasties, violent films, which led to cries for tighter regulations by the British Board of Film Classification. Similarly, most people familiar with my boy, motherfucker Jack Bruce Thompson, who can't even practice law in the state of Florida anymore for his bullshit and his constant attempts, many of which were successful in at least changing public opinion to create a moral panic regarding video games, got his start initially by stating that 14-year-old Michael Carneal, who killed 3 and injured 5 in the 1997 Heath High School shooting incident, that he actually trained to kill using video games like Doom and Wolfenstein.
Well, in 1999, I represented 6 parents whose 3 children were shot and killed in Paducah, Kentucky. Michael Carneal trained on the game Doom to do it. The American Psychological Association in August of 2005 issued a blockbuster report which says that there's a direct causal link between interactive gameplay of violent games and real-world increased aggression and violence in adolescents and teenagers.
Have you seen those games? Oh yeah, this is next-level realism. The ramifications of the moral panics against video games left waves in the games industry for decades to come, and those ripples, they're still rolling in. Really, what was Gamergate beyond Jack Thompson 2.0? Something we find reprehensible in video games is causing detrimental effects to society. Well, you don't really need proof. You can just make a claim and cause a moral panic, can't you? Then there's the 1993 murder of Stephen Lawrence, a black British teenager who was murdered by a gang of white people after, according to a witness, calling him a nigger. The legal proceeding lasted for over a decade and brought about massive reform in the British police force, due in part to the outcry of racism and the newly instilled fear that this case brought, that racism was rampant in the United Kingdom. So remorseful had the British people and the British government been, that in 2013 his mother Doreen was made a baroness and given a seat in the House of Lords. Similarly, like many of these cases inspiring plays and musicals and TV shows and plenty of other subsequent media, was the 1998 murder of Matthew Shepard, a gay youth who was beaten and left for dead tied to a fence, whose death again made national news and sparked disgust over the cruelty clearly laying dormant in peaceful American towns like Laramie, Wyoming, and whose death was the direct impetus behind Obama's Obama's 2009 Matthew Shepard Act, which massively widened the scope of federal intervention in the investigation and prosecution of hate crimes. Events often serve as the impetus behind this spiraling cycle that evolves into an outright moral panic, and it needs to be said that the reality and seriousness of the event itself are ultimately irrelevant. In the first part of this two-part video, I mentioned that one of the most grievous moral panics of the last 100 years was the Red Scare. Certainly, though, that was based on a real issue. That is, McCarthy himself didn't do nothing. There really were Russian operatives and spies in the United States working for the purpose of subverting our government. That fact alone is not the moral panic. As with many of the incidences previously cited, the igniting factor is often based on reality. But the reality has little to do with the ensuing insanity. A moral panic is the behavior and the reaction that ensues in response to a root incident or a perceived root incident, regardless of the truthfulness of that incident, as we will come to see, with the goal of enacting cultural and social change. If through all of this and these descriptions of these events that have sparked moral panics, are you starting to see a little bit of that pattern here? Well, that's because moral outrages and moral panics tend to occur in stages, which are as follows. 1. There is a threat to society or community norms. People are appalled that children could kill children over watching a movie or playing a video game. They are terrified that there is some sort of evil lying just beneath the placid surface of their seemingly normal communities. 2. There is a labeling or symbolizing of the perceived threat, often onto a scapegoat, which is where moral panics often begin to miss the mark by aiming for the wrong target. This is also called the inventory phase, wherein shortly after a disaster or threat, there is a scrambling sense of disorganization and a desperate search for an icon to absorb the blame. Was the issue with Michael Carneal really that video games were virtual murder training? Or was it simply that Carneal was a deeply psychologically disturbed young man who was being bullied by his peers and not getting the therapy he desperately needed? Was not the more obvious moral panic one regarding the treatment of mental health issues in youth or coping with bullying? Those are a bit more complicated issues, while video games, in contrast, are an easily identifiable cause and the much more simplistic symbol to latch onto. The less complex the thought process involved need be then. Cohen describes ultimately a three-point process of symbolization. Words, MAGA, alt-right, conservative. These words become symbolic of a certain status therein. Nazi, KKK, sexist, racist, homophobe, whatever. Then objects, a red hat, a Confederate flag, a fashy haircut, a fucking glass of milk. These objects come to symbolize the word. And finally, the objects come to be symbolic of the status. Remember when I talked about the stigmatized? And how they have certain things that symbolize you are part of the stigmatized group. These are symbols of status. That is, were I to wear my MAGA hat and my Women for Trump pin outside when visiting Philadelphia, I should expect to get my ass beat, because the objects I am wearing are associated with the status of Nazi, KKK, whatever. Once again, we find ourselves drawn back into social identity and symbolic identification towards or against our in and out groups. 3. The symbol arouses public concern, typically through the exaggeration and distortion of the original event and the actor or symbol of concern. As I stated earlier, both through the agenda-setting function of the media and through the functions of our social networks, the concept of the symbol and its nefarious nature begin to spread until it becomes seemingly ubiquitous, on everyone's mind. And soon, everyone, having seen the obvious association with the threat identified in Step 1, everyone also comes to associate the symbol with a threat to our society. This is exacerbated potentially by the media, which tends to begin to utilize a shotgun approach to the topic, blasting primetime and newspaper covers with the topic over and over and over, so that it is inescapable. See Knopf 1970. Moreover, Knopf as far back as 1970 noted that the media tends to conflate the importance or seriousness of events as equivalent to make them seem the same. For example, note how whenever Antifa burns buildings or assaults old men in wheelchairs, it is described as a mostly peaceful protest. For example, these people jumping on a car were disrupting a mostly peaceful protest. But Charlottesville, in contrast, has consistently been called a riot. The 15,000+ people who showed up to display their utter contempt for the 20, in contrast, people demonstrating for free speech in Boston were merely counter-protesters. Do you see the framing being used here? This is a specific use of framing technique of media, and when done in repetition, helps establish a cognitive heuristic neural pathway in the long-term listener or viewer. That means that these ideas become associated with one another in your neural net. Priming and framing devices are very useful for this. I've talked about this before, but if I talk about the color orange and then I ask you to think of a fruit, what's the first fruit that comes to mind? That's a priming effect. Moreover, using framing to constantly state terms that, for example, the alt-right, or whoever you want to call alt-right, because they will call everyone alt-right, are evil and terrible, racist, sexist, misogynists, and they hate Jews and all of this. They want to kill all of us, and you keep saying that over and over.
What they want to do, and in their hearts, is extinguish people who look like me and who look like you, Wolf. Jewish people, black people, even women. They don't think that we're equal to them.
Meanwhile, you call Antifa peaceful protesters. That's a framing device. As such, it's no surprise that people think Antifa are not a terrorist organization and can't understand why hundreds of thousands of people would want them to be labeled as such. No, in the media, Antifa are the peaceful protesters. Trump supporters are tiki torch wielding racists and rioters, adding communication across personal channels reinforcing these heuristics. And this becomes nigh unquestionable in the true believer. While I have frequently touted that the both positive and negative effect, well, negative at least for researchers, is the tendency of media psychology in that it has very small effect sizes, sociologists who do specialize in moral panics have found that when it comes to hysteria, the media does play an important role, particularly when it comes to setting the agenda and determining what everyone is thinking about. You cannot escape this issue because the media is blasting it. 4. There is a response from a public figure to the event or issue. Of course, in the case of Charlottesville, Trump's honest and even-handed response condemning violence on both sides was met with outrage because it did not seem to paint a bullseye on the symbol identified as associated intrinsically with that initial threat.
His speech was without thought. It was without reason. It was devoid of facts. It was devoid of wisdom. There was no gravitas. There was no sanity there. He was like a child blaming a sibling on something else. He did it. I didn't do it. He certainly opened up the race wound from Charlottesville, a man clearly wounded by the rational people who are abandoning him in droves, meaning those business people and the people in Washington now who are questioning his fitness for office and whether he is stable.
The mainstream public, due in part to social networking and in part due to the agenda-setting function of the media, to paint Charlottesville as just one incidence of massive, widespread Nazi violence in the United States also painted Trump, conservatives, and anyone to the right as symbolic of the racist, Nazi, KKK threat directly responsible for Heather Heyer's death. Now, of course, this was, once again, missing the mark, particularly given that the Antifa have been far more prone to violence, as we have seen time and time again. It's not massive groups of Nazis going out and burning buildings. It's Antifa. It's Black Lives Matter. But remember, across these same groups of people, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are part of their in-group. They are one of us. Therefore, not only did Trump attack members of their shared social in-group, he failed to pin the tail on the symbol of their moral panic. And that was so enraging because of the ultimate outcome of a moral panic, which is to change the society or to change public policy. As you may have noticed in some of the examples I provided above, major moral panics lead to major changes in the community wherein they occur. While Theresa May and Barack Obama responded years later to the murders of Stephen Lawrence and Matthew Shepard respectively, their policies and changes to institutions made under their mandate were ultimately a response to a moral panic, the moral panics that ensued over those deaths. Change is the purpose of a moral panic, to eliminate the symbol associated with the initial threat, which in our current situation is the right, having been symbolized as a homegrown menace ready to saddle up with their jackboots and white robes to kill your black friends. No wonder then that the media and the left was so incensed at Trump's response, because ultimately the desired outcome really is to do something drastic about the right, be that to make it illegal for them to protest in public or outright line them up and put them in camps. I know the latter seems like a true absurdity, but given what we know about moral panics manifesting themselves in the populace, it's not that crazy, really. One fear when it comes to moral panics is the potentiality for vigilante justice or perceived justice, particularly when individuals feel they have been failed by the governing bodies. As such, we need to understand how moral panics, given we are definitely thoroughly within one function. Both Cohen 2002 in the updated version of the initial book and further Good and Ben Yehuda 2010 describe the characteristics of a moral panic as such. Concern. There must be the belief that the behavior of the group or the activity deemed deviant is likely to have a negative effect on society, such as I have described, but moreover that deviance is an attitude that is placed upon a group or an object, not necessarily a trait of the object or group itself, given that deviance is a function of social perception. While I have described stigma placed upon certain groups as being considered subhuman, there is also Becker's notion of deviance, which is, quote, created by society, that social groups create deviance by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviancies and by applying those rules. From this point of view, deviance is not a quality of the act the person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender. The deviant is one to whom the label has been successfully applied. That's Becker 1963, page 9. As we have seen that the outrage is often placed incorrectly on an innocent actor. Unlike stigma, which uses symbols to isolate and identify a stigmatized person, societal deviance is reliant on the audience, not the actor, him or herself. That is, given the group determines what is deviant behavior or a deviant individual, at some level there is little capacity for the stigmatized deviant to ameliorate their negative position in society. We see this actor versus audience effect typified by most moral panics. That is, the audience is the star of the stage, not really the issue or the source of their outrage, as ultimately, labels as deviants or folk devils are applied more than they are earned. Hostility. Hostility toward the group in question increases, and they become folk devils. A clear division forms between them and us. Here is where we begin once again to tie in moral panics to social identity. There is already an us versus them narrative across the left, that the right are a stigmatized other. To transform them from merely being subhuman to being an outright demon or a devil is actually quite a short walk then, is it not? Moreover, again, unlike stigma, which is typically indicated through symbols, hostility and outgroup hatred in the case of moral panics is reliance on the perception of deviant behavior or deviant association, which again, as I just described, arises externally from the audience, not from the individual. Consensus. Though concern does not have to be nationwide, there must be widespread acceptance that the group in question poses a very real threat to society. It is important at this stage that the moral entrepreneurs are vocal and the folk devils, in contrast, appear weak and disorganized. Part of this consensus is, however, false and fabricated typically. The problem is that, as we have come to understand, for various reasons the left does not want to speak to the right, and their thought leaders in the mainstream media actively encourage the illusion of consensus by themselves refusing to engage with the right in earnest. And when they do invite the rare, usually self-proclaimed conservative onto one of their programs, it is to serve as further proof of the consensus, typically inviting one against a panel of 4 or 5.
You're almost doing his work for him when we start calling him insane. So that's the first comment that I have to make about that.
You thought his speech was sane? You thought it was a rational speech?
I thought that sounded exactly like a speech he gave in the campaign, and no one was calling him, let's have a whole panel discussion about how insane he is during the campaign. And so, you can disagree with what the president's saying.
I'm offended that you continue to go there, Paris, but the reality is that President Trump has not done enough, and I'm ashamed that you, as an African-American, Paris, will not say that.
Well, Keith, I don't need you to try to pull my black card. I am well aware of my blackness and don't need you to try to classify me as being one. I understand what racism is. Keith, don't go there. Do not go there. I know what it means to be a black man in this country. I know, and I experience racism on a regular basis by being a Trump supporter and by being a proud American who happens to be a Republican. I get racist.
So that's the racism you experience by being a Trump
I get
supporter?
I get racist comments about my family, about my mother, about my girlfriend, about my character every single day from mostly coming from black people, Keith. If you really want to get down to it, my family's from Georgia. Keith, let me finish.
Or by hosting conservatives like Anna Navarro who agree with all of their points and are right-wing only by their own description, not by their beliefs or actions. This is an intentional framing device to make the right seem both weak and disorganized, while simultaneously representing the vile threat that is causing this moral panic. Another important note about the idea of consensus is it will often be reached by force if necessary. For example, in the 1980s, there was a massive hysteria over the fear that children were being molested in Satan-worshipping daycares across the United States, and could be described much like any other moral panic. But a unique component is that the stories of molestation and abuse were found to be predominantly fabricated through psychologists implanting memories in children, or by using such a wide criteria of describing abuse to a child, it was unlikely that he or she really understood the questions being asked, nor how to answer them.
Based on their videotaped interviews, they said that more than 90% of the 400 preschoolers they talked to reported signs of sexual abuse.
Mr. Parrott, can you help Susie show us what happened to her?
You have interviews that will start off with a therapist asking a child whether they had ever played any naked games. At McMartin, this was a huge topic, was naked games. And the children initially say no. The therapist, though, didn't accept those answers. So then they repeat the question. And then they repeat it again. Eventually, the children realize that their interview is never going to be allowed to end until they start giving the interviewer the kind of answer that she wants to hear.
Feminists looking for female victims and the religious right were, for once, allies. Both were so desperate for confirmation of all of their fears that they arguably deeply abused and traumatized the very children they were claiming to fight for, by forcing them into saying yes to these allegations of molestation, subjecting them to pointless and potentially harmful regression therapy, all to prove the existence of a consensus. The media is also beyond merely complicit in this, in that in the past it has not only aided in the focus of attention on the symbols of deviance in order to define more clearly what the stigmatized deviant outsider looks like, acts like, and says, but to outright manufacture fake news to conform to the perception of a consensus that not only do the deviants exist, but that they are numerous, and their deviant behavior will reoccur, that the deviants are wholly negative without redeeming qualities. And finally, as Cohen 2002 describes in his analysis of the mods and rockers, that this reaches a fever pitch of pure religiosity, complete with a full understanding of the demonology and hagiology, all within a short span of a news cycle. Who is the devil? Who are the angels? Yes, while the term fake news may be new, the term manufactured news is quite old, and has been a long-term function of the media as it has become more ubiquitous in our society. But be aware, this news being manufactured outright or merely exaggerated results in a completely clueless populace who, as we have seen, cannot describe the outrage or the panic or the deviant that they are raging against other than racist, sexist Trump supporter. They can't describe what they are protesting for. Once again, we return to the purpose of the social network and how events can be cognitively rewritten by consensus, returning us all the way back to Asch 1951, a false consensus, affecting cognition and behavior. If all of your friends say their Antifa protest was peaceful, and if the news says their Antifa protest was peaceful, meanwhile all of your friends say this other protest was violent and a riot, and the news says it was a violent riot too, it doesn't really matter if you yourself beat someone over the head with a fucking bike lock. The effective consensus can rewrite our experiences and perception of events. Disproportionality. The action taken is disproportionate to the actual threat posed by the accused group. This is absolutely what we are seeing now, with calls to outright punch people merely for being white, to riot in the streets, to burn buildings, to impeach the President of the United States over what? This characteristic should be of particular note because it includes instances of drawn-out legal cases and potentially even vigilante justice. In the McMartin preschool trial, as I mentioned above, for example, the case cost $15 million and lasted a total of 7 years, making it one of the most expensive civil cases in the history of the United States. We therefore can see the financial and legal repercussions of a moral panic, but that's not where it ends. In 2000, following the public murder of an 8-year-old girl, Sarah Payne, the British news outlet News of the World publicly called out and named the names of, quote, known pedophiles in the United Kingdom, running off the initial threat posed by the girl's death and the subsequent identification of so-called pedophiles as needing of purging. And by the way, as with any of these things, do not take my analysis as an approval of these actions. I find pedophiles reprehensible, but still not worthy of any action until they've committed a crime, same as with anybody else, regardless of their beliefs or proclivities, no matter how vile I may find them. As long as they remain mere thoughts, it's not ground for legal action. But moreover, in this case, it was not just pedophiles who were named, but anyone on the sex offender registry, including individuals who had been convicted at the time of gay sex, rape, or any form of sexual child abuse. Well, in concordance with the moral panic, the naming of these individuals in this instance led to massive public outcry, with large mobs of people seeking justice from all of the pedophiles, either convicted or merely accused in the Now publication. While again I despise pedophilia, in the case of Sarah Payne, there was no evidence in the autopsy that the girl had been sexually assaulted, and further, many of the individuals whose personal lives were interrupted, if not outright destroyed by this, were not even convicted pedophiles. Again, at the time, merely being gay could have landed you on that list. And the response far from ends there. Given we know the stigmatized and deviant have symbols that identify them, we begin to see individuals, out of fear of the perceived threat, out of their hatred and disgust for the deviant, begin to ban them from establishments. For example, the typical reaction begins in the forms of the police, the courts, and finally local action groups. Part of the problem is that as the panic increases and the news continues to shotgun stories about it, identification of deviants associated with the panic become less and less salient. Suddenly, any red ball cap could be a MAGA hat, and someone to be avoided, someone to ban from your shop, someone to beat up on the street, someone who should receive an unfair trial in court.
If it were not Mr. D'Souza, we'd have a different conversation. There is not a single case where someone like Mr. D'Souza, who is a first-time offender, has gone to prison. Yet, the government wants to send Mr. D'Souza to a federal prison for 2 years.
The claim of selective prosecution is all hat, no cattle. Here is my decision.
All rise.
It is my judgment that he be locked up overnight for 8 months in a community confinement center. 5 years probation. Mr. D'Souza is required to do community service every week for 8 hours for 5 years. And he is to participate in weekly therapeutic counseling. We are adjourned.
And if not actively targeted by the police, certainly one not to be aided by them. This is all an attempt to control the perceived deviance, the evil present in society, by any means necessary. Hey, does that sound familiar? As the panic escalates, the innovation in coping with deviance becomes more complex and more restrictive, from banning of certain forms of clothing, either within private establishments or with call for public legal ban of the symbology of the deviant, to calls for increased police force being used against the offenders, which is astounding in this case given that those lost in their moral panic are often usually supporters of Black Lives Matter and not fans of the police. And finally, when it seems the police and the government just aren't doing enough, the individual is left to take actions into his own hands. We are seeing expressions of perceived justified vigilantism today, with, for example, Eric Clinton, a professor who, to this day, seemingly feels no remorse nor regret for his vicious attack on an innocent man at one of those Berkeley riots, instead releasing a statement not denying the allegations that he committed a potentially fatal attack upon another human, but only that the manner in which he was caught was not fair, because members of the outgroup he despises so much, the right, were involved in his unmasking.
Yes, might have gotten away with it too. It wasn't for these blasted kids and their
weaponized autism.
In Eric's mind, activated with his social identity before personal identity with his outgroup hate from the moral standard of said in-group moral mentality, and in the throes of a moral panic, is it any wonder why he does not recant his behavior, only his apprehension? After all, he was fighting a demon. He was attacking a monster, slaying the dragon. This is why the left routinely beats and attacks even people of color who have the audacity to attempt to communicate with them, because they know this person is not only subhuman, but in a form of magical thinking, an outright folk demon that need be exorcised and destroyed. This is the mindset of the left engulfed in the passionate flames of their own moral panic, engaging in their own Salem witch trials, their own form of a Red Scare.
And isn't it ironic?
Which, while not currently enforced by the state, is enforced by the Fourth Estate in their condemnation of all on the right, no matter how slightly, as mutants that need be expunged, the stigmatized other, the evil beasts that do more than just not agree with us. They are ultimately a threat to the very fabric of our society, are they not? Is this all starting to come together? In-group love, out-group hate as a product of moral preoccupation, cult-like behavior in the form of the shared mythos, magical thinking, expunging of the impure individuals in one's life, and the cessation of communication with the stigmatized group, the perception of the outgroup as just that, subhuman, the outrage and induction of the moral panic. This is the absolute state of the left. But it is not without hope, for we have not yet covered the last characteristic of a moral panic, which is as follows. Volatility. Moral panics are highly volatile and tend to disappear as quickly as they appeared because public interest wanes or news coverage changes to another narrative, another issue. The fear that everyone around you is a brown-shirted Nazi trying to beat in your door and fuck your boyfriend because the brown shirts were notoriously homosexual, beat in your door and take you away to the camps, is surely terrifying to these absurdist leftists who are so warped in their social identity and moral panic sense of utter insanity, but this too shall pass. To further quote T.S. Eliot in his own quotation of Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, and in all manner of things shall be well. And call me a silly ninny of an optimist, but knowing what we know about moral panics, how they tend to peter out quite quickly in favor of something new and more interesting, particularly in the world of the 24-hour news cycle, wherein we find a veritable drug-like satisfying effect of latching onto the newest moral panic, of which frankly arises seemingly every day, yes, this too shall pass. We are already seeing the media refocusing on the absurdist Russian hacking narrative rather than the supposed rampant Nazi narrative present on every street corner. And if you're wondering if there are Nazis,
ask the Nazi
on the corner, ask the
Nazi
in the grocery.
serious video, I want to bring in something a bit comical, or more accurately related to a comic strip writer who wrote an excellent article explaining this all in a far more succinct way than I. Scott Adams suggests, based on the psychology we have discussed over these past two videos, that when you are embroiled in a moral panic, it is impossible to recognize the illogical imbroglio of your actions, which we have seen time and time again, is seemingly true. But as proof of concept, I want to raise to you in the ending of this whole thing his question and method of identifying if you, yourself, are suffering from the effects of a moral panic. Of course, recognizing that you are in a moral panic will only activate your own cognitive dissonance, as we have mentioned, and oh holy fuck, that was a whole 8,000 words ago, and moreover, your face threat to the preservation of your social identity and your in-group, and finally, the need for consensus desired by those embroiled in said panic in this particular instance, but let's talk about it anyway. If you are capable of understanding the logic, well then congratulations. It means you're not involved in the mass hysteria. But that doesn't do anything, again, to ameliorate the said hysteria, and honestly, beyond the paltry leave them alone and be polite kind of arguments that I made in the first part of this video, I'm not sure what any of us on the outside can do until they find a new topic of insanity. And so long as Trump is president, I'm not sure what that's gonna be, or if it's going to be as volatile as moral panics typically are. Anyway, here's Scott Adams. If you already believed President Trump is a racist, his weak statement about Charlottesville will seem like confirmation. But if you believe he never offered moral leadership, only equal treatment under the law, that's what you saw instead. And you made up your own mind about the morality. The tricky part here is that any interpretation of what happened could be confirmation bias. But ask yourself, which one of these versions sounds less crazy? One, a sitting president who is a branding expert, thought it would be a good idea to go easy on murderous Nazis as a way to improve his popularity, or 2, the country elected a racist leader who is winking at the KKK and white supremacists that they have a free pass to start a race war now, or 3, a mentally unstable racist clown with con man skills, mostly just lying, eviscerated the Republican primary field and won the presidency. He keeps doing crazy, impulsive, racist stuff, but for some reason the economy is doing well, jobs are looking good, North Korea blinked, ISIS is on the ropes, and the Supreme Court got a qualified judge. It was mostly luck. Or 4, the guy who didn't offer to be your moral leader, didn't offer any moral leadership, just law and order applied equally. His critics cleverly and predictably framed it as being soft on Nazis. One of those narratives is less crazy sounding than the others. That doesn't mean the less crazy one has to be true. But normal stuff happens far more often than crazy stuff, and critics will frame normal stuff as crazy whenever they get the chance.
Occam's razor, it's a basic scientific principle, and it says, all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one.
Makes sense to me.
All right. So what's more likely?
So finally, let's absolutely prove Adam's point with this panel of Trump supporters who believed very much in that 4th option, to the shock and chagrin of this anchor, who is so enveloped in all of the elements of social identity, stigmatization of the other, hatred of the outgroup, cult-like thinking, and ultimately moral panic, she cannot even comprehend how one might choose 4 before 1, 2, or 3.
Address the problem. I mean, let's face the reality. There are problems on both sides.
Do you think that neo-Nazis and white supremacists are the same as those who are protesting them?
I think it's ridiculous to have me choose between Hitler and Stalin, which is what I consider both groups are.
And why are the people who turned out to protest Nazis,
Not
why
all of
are
them.
they Stalin to you?
The Antifa group to me is totally a very Stalinish kind of group.
How so?
If you're willing to set fires and burn places to the ground, that doesn't sound like a very peaceful group to me.
But they're
both the same evil.
They didn't use those tactics in Charlottesville.
But I'm telling you, I've seen videos of other people who were out there who were not neo-Nazis.
You believe that there were very fine people protesting?
Yes, I do.
How do you know that?
I'm only telling you from videos that I've seen that people...
But what's the source of your videos? But again, it seems to me that you're giving these guys a green light. The white supremacists.
No, green light is wrong.
Not at all.
Media is not covering it. They're only focused on making neo-Nazis and white supremacists out to be Trump supporters, and they're the issue of the problem. The reality is of what Trump said is there were 2 sides. There are 2 parties that participated.
He said there was trouble on both sides. Was there not trouble on both sides? Because I saw bats on both sides.
And I'm sure you've heard the argument. There was violence on both sides of World War II also.
Yeah.
I think I've fully explicated both the social identity of the current left, their psychology, and their mindset. At least at large. Of course, be aware I'm only making these claims based off of averages and broad things that I'm observing that come from the realm of social psychology and media psychology. None of this ever describes a single individual, as we are, after all, truly special snowflakes in some ways. As one last note, if you are interested in reading more about moral panics, I have cited primarily in this video from Cohen 1974 and the updated version Cohen 2002, as well as Good and Ben Yehuda 2010. I highly suggest you check out all 3. I found all to be very accessible reads, perhaps excessively so, being myself a little bit more used to data outputs than sociology texts. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altanavolt.
Investigated all the books in the library, 90% of those got to be thrown away. Investigated all the people that I know, 98% of them have got to go. The other 2% of fellow birchers, just like me. Well, I finally started thinking straight when I run out of things to investigate. Couldn't imagine anything else, so now you find me at home investigating myself. Hope I don't find out nothing. Good God.